state governments at the time, they just did not want those independent Indian nations in the state boundaries, because that was a group of people that resisted their authority and resisted their government. And, right about then, government was a pretty hot button for people. Who had the right to rule over who was becoming a major issue and was going to start to fuel the Civil War. So there was a lot of turmoil and already a lot of friction and a lot of fighting right about then. So the states within themselves did not want an Indian nation in the state that they could not control and that did not fall under their rules, that followed their own set of rules. And the Indians did not want to relocate or give up their identities. They were living on land that they had lived on for a long time, centuries, and it had been handed down, and it was prime land. It was worth a lot of money in an economical sense. When they got moved, they lost their inheritances. It's like, think about land that's maybe in your family. I know my family has farmland that's been passed down for over 100 years from one generation to the next. And the place I grew up on, I would be the fourth generation to live on it. And that's not even near as long as the Cherokees had lived on their lands. And, when a family holds ownership of something, they have something to pass down to their children. That was robbed of the Cherokee. And not only was it robbed from them, it was robbed from their future generations. So they were not only fighting to hold on to something that they had for centuries, they were fighting to hold on to it for future generations. And so you can see the conflict building between the two. So there was something called the Compact of 1802. This, where the state of Georgia gave the national government some Western land claims. They basically said, hey, you can have authority over this land, which eventually became the states of Alabama and Mississippi, if you will get the Indian people out of our state and somewhere else, relocate them. So the Cherokee, they said they weren't moving. And do you blame them? That they had lived there forever. So no, they were not going to move. They even went as far to establish a capital in 1825 at New Dakota, which is behind me. And it's also where a treaty was signed that we're going to talk about. So they were led by the principal chief, John Ross, and Major Ridge. Remember that name, Major Ridge and John Ross. Major Ridge was the speaker of the Cherokee National Council. So the National Council was like their government. So Major Ridge was sort of, in a sense, I guess it would be similar to Speaker of the House. He was speaker for the council. And then Chief John Ross would have been like the president. He was the principal chief. He was the main boss. So they sat down and adopted a written constitution on July 26th of 1827. And they declared the Cherokee Nation to be a sovereign and independent nation. So in a sense, they wrote their own Declaration of Independence. My phone's going crazy, ignore it. So then, with that constitution, an election was held for principal chief, which John Ross had been principal chief, but they held an official election. John Ross won the first election and became total leader and representative of the tribe. Give me a second, I'm going to mute my phone. Okay, I'm back. So John Ross became principal chief. Here's a really important thing that I want you to remember, because it's going to be the basis for some assassinations later on. The Cherokee government in 1828 established a law that talked about the removal, because they felt like it was going to be an issue. And guess what? It became an issue. It stated, anyone who signed an agreement with the United States that addressed the Cherokee land without consent of the Cherokee government would be considered a traitor and treasonous, and it was punishable by death. So basically it said anybody who made a deal with the government without having the total approval of the Cherokee people. They go behind our back, make a deal with the government. You will be punished with death by the Cherokee government. It's treason. You're a traitor. You're Benedict Arnold. So that's important. Remember that. So Andrew Jackson gets reelected in 1832. And some of the opponents of the Cherokee removal, which everybody was opposed, but some of them were just the loudest to say, no, we're not going to do this. They started to rethink things. And they realized Andrew Jackson had been reelected. He was all for removing the Cherokee. And they began to see that it was inevitable. They were going to be removed. It was going to happen. This is all important, so you know what really fueled some of Stan Watie's decisions later in life. So this group of people began to think, if we go ahead and we make a deal with the government now, and we get paid, and we get help, and we move out on the government's terms, it's going to be a lot easier for us than if they come in and they just force us out. So they began to look ahead and see what would be best for them. And they started a party. That party was led by Major Ridge. Remember, he was Speaker of the Cherokee government, the National Council. His son, John Ridge, his nephews, Elias Boudinot, which is Stan Watie's brother, and Stan Watie himself. And they became known as the Ridge Party. So they were a little small group of Cherokees within the Cherokee Nation who wanted to make a deal with the government to be removed on the government's terms, paid by the government, so that they weren't forced out and things would go easier on them. So they started trying to sway other Cherokee people over to their side because they believed that it was going to be the best thing for the people and the only way to get good, favorable terms from the U.S. government. Before the land was just taken from them and they were forced out and they had no bargaining chip. So, excuse me. So, they weren't wrong because Georgia was already anticipating, with Andrew Jackson being reelected, that the Cherokees were going to be removed. They went ahead and started holding land lotteries and dividing up Cherokee tribal lands among the white Georgians. And the Cherokees were still trying to hold on to that land, and they were so, like, the Maine government, Chief John Ross and the Maine government were very, very opposed to being removed. Well, then Georgia is already trying to divide up their land and kind of elbow them out, and then you have this little party called the Ridge Party in the middle of it who just want to negotiate and get good terms and get out before it gets really bad. So Principal John Ross and the majority of the Cherokee people were adamantly opposed to being removed. And so this is where some kind of political sneakiness started. Chief John Ross canceled the tribal elections in 1832. The council, the government, threatened to impeach the Ridges, because remember, the Ridges were the ones who formed the Ridge Party and were trying to make a deal with the government, which Cherokee law stated was treason. And the Ridges held political positions within the tribe. So some political maneuvering started to try to get the Ridges removed. Then there was a very prominent member of the Treaty Party, or the Ridge Party, which was murdered. His name's John Walker Jr. And the Ridges responded by forming their own little small government within the Cherokee Nation. Now remember this, because during the Civil War, there was also a whole other civil war being fought in Indian Territory between the two sides of the Cherokee Nation. And this is where it started. This is where the opposing sides started. So one side was all for the majority was all for staying put and waiting to see what would happen and calling the government's bluff and saying, oh, you're not really going to move us. And the other side, the smaller side, formed its own little government within the Cherokee Nation and were kind of viewed as traitors who were trying to make a deal with the government because they did not believe the government was going to bluff. They believed the government really would move them out. So that's where a whole divide started. So there were some that were following Ross, Chief John Ross, the principal chief. That was the majority of the tribe, and they were known as the National Party. Then the Treaty Party, or the Ridge Party, elected a chief, their own chief. Remember, they were trying to build their own little government, William A. Hicks.